Today, my guest is David McAlvany. He's a graduate of Biola. He formerly was a wealth manager at Morgan Stanley and is a second-generation CEO of McAlvany Family Companies. He's a frequent guest on national TV programs like CNBC, Fox News, Fox Business News, Bloomberg, and financial seminars around the world. David's recently written a white paper about inflation. It's called A Chicken or an Empire, Your Choice. David, good to see you today.
Great to see you too.
I want to start with just this challenge of John Maynard Keynes that if you understand inflation, that you'll be one in a million. So I need to understand it so that I can join the ranks of one out of a million. You want to start with the definition of inflation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I think John Maynard Keynes wanted inflation to remain somewhat of an obscure policy. When you implement it proactively, his comment was that not one in a million people will understand it. And that's an advantage if you're a policymaker because you can get away with all kinds of things and no one will even know. But inflation is defined as an increase in the quantity of money, and that results in the dilution of purchasing power. When you lose purchasing power, all of a sudden it takes more currency units, whether it's dollars or yen or euros, to buy the same stuff. So you encounter inflation as an increase in the costs of goods and services. And that's what becomes obvious. Oh my goodness, my money's just not going as far as it used to. Things are going up. Or, sometimes we'll experience inflation this way. You go to the grocery store and the box of cereal, which used to be 16 ounces, is now 14 ounces, but for the same price. So shrinkflation is another version of inflation. It's having to pay more for less.
Yeah, we opened a bottle of a vitamin supplement that we like to buy, and we noticed that the bottle was only half full. I don't know why they keep it in the same bottle, but there are fewer tablets inside, and that's a form of inflation.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that they've tried to do through time is come up with good measures for inflation. So we have these metrics like the consumer price index, or if you're looking at the costs of things that go into manufactured goods, the producer price index. And these are supposed to measure the changes of the costs of things through time. And the real purpose was how much does it cost to maintain a basic lifestyle throughout time? And I think the unfortunate aspect for you and me as consumers, as people go to the grocery store and take care of our families and whatnot, is that they've changed the parts that go into that basket so often that we really don't have the same sort of lifestyle implied originally. We're not talking about the same numbers as we used to be.
Yeah, for sure. So, David, you say that inflation is like air. It's not something you think about very much, but it's extremely important.
It is important. It is important, and it's not until there's a critical point. Like if you don't have air, you might not pay attention to that every day, but then you can't breathe, and you really do pay attention. And in that way, inflation is one of those factors that you don't think about every day. And then all of a sudden, when you're dealing with frustration of not being able to have ends meet, it really does become a critical issue. So money we take for granted. And what money is, we take for granted. The old definitions of money: a unit of account, a means of exchange, a store of value. These are things that money is supposed to be. And we began to change the definition of money in a very material way when we disassociated our money, the US dollar, from gold back in 1971. And what that allowed us to do is create something that's a little bit confusing. Now our central banks, not tied to the limits of a gold supply, could create as much money as they wanted and create as much credit as they wanted. So today you actually have to look at credit and money as almost being the same kind of thing, because that's where you see a lot of monetary growth is in the world of credit.
Well, David, you talk about this idea that digital money is now being called a coin when it's not a coin, and they're using the term mining when they're not actually mining in the traditional sense. It alludes to this idea of real money, but in fact, it's not.
Yeah, and I love the fact that there's innovations happening and technology is allowing for change we should be clear that no, there aren't actually coins or tokens in existence. There's still ones and zeros in the digital ether when we're talking about cryptocurrencies. And mining is not exactly digging in the dirt. It's just solving mathematical problems. And so really all you have with a cryptocurrency is a receipt for the solution of a math problem. So you're being given this, imagine it as a piece of paper. You're not even getting a piece of paper, but if it was a piece of paper, it's a receipt to prove that a math problem was solved. Now you are the proud owner of a receipt. It's called proof of work. And that's kind of interesting in and of itself in terms of just how we've taken and borrowed coin, mining, and these terms and given credibility to something that, again, lots of innovation. There's a lot of promise tied to cryptocurrencies, but I don't think they're a replacement for existing currencies. And Chuck, one of the reasons why I hold a pretty strong line on that is because you have central banks that are not willing to give up the privileges that come with printing money. This
Sure.
is quite the franchise. I mean, if you've ever known someone who's owned a Chick-fil-A franchise or a McDonald's franchise, I mean, these are great franchises, right? But there's no better franchise in the world than a money printing franchise, where you will not go to jail for printing an infinite number of currency units. And to give that up and to not put in a real fight to maintain it, I think that's where the new crowd has a little bit of political naivete, but I think the world and the markets will solve that for them shortly.
I'm in your camp on that, David. I think that they are not going to the cartel is not going to give up easily. And my thought is that one day, digital currencies that are not controlled by central banks will be declared illegal, almost like drugs. You know, some drugs are declared legal and you can buy them over the counter, and some are illegal and you have to get government approval. And I think that's going to be the same with digital currencies. But I want to talk about your paper specifically on inflation because I love the analogy you used, and it really gets to a solution for Christians, and we're going to come to that near the end of our discussion. But I want to get to the heart of what I think many people are wondering right now. Do you think that inflation is transitory, meaning that it's going to come and go? The Federal Reserve has answered positively on that account. They think they're going to be able to control this. There are others who say, no way. Dr. Michael Burry, famous for The Big Short, says we're headed to the Weimar Republic model of hyperinflation. He's certain of that. And others, like Steve Forbes, have recently said, no, hyperinflation is not coming. So what's your position on that, David?
Well, the transitory, the answer is yes and no. And there's a change that's occurred here in 2020, here recently, that I think is very significant. It will be an accelerant to inflation in the future. There are elements of inflation which I think are going to go away. And some of those relate to the supply chain bottlenecks that are part and parcel to COVID-19 and sort of a global shutdown of our economy. And so some of those we will work through. What is not going to change is the government's rediscovery of directing money and credit to politically favored recipients. And this is something, again, we've looked at the monetary policy gurus. These are the folks that run the central banks, our Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China. And these are the folks that are making decisions about how much money is in circulation. But a lot of we go back to credit being a part of the new money system. A lot of the credit as money that has been created has been locked up in the bowels of the world financial system, and they have not been in the larger global economy. So we've had massive monetary expansion without a lot of inflation. What transitioned in 2020, and you could say that COVID was something of a catalyst for this, is that governments have figured out that they don't need the central bankers to stimulate growth. They can take credit, they can take money and distribute it, again, to politically favored recipients. So you have things like the CARES Act or PPP or the Main Street Lending Program. I talked to a banker just yesterday, and he said, the biggest problem we have right now is we have so much money coming from the feds and no place to put it. There's not actually demand for loans. So he's got a conundrum. Our government is willing to say, here's all this money, go do something with it. And the difference now between what we've had over the last 10 years is that, again, governments are now the ones managing the distribution as opposed to central banks. And central banks were more than happy to see it stuck in the financial markets. And we did get some asset price inflation, but governments are directing it to the people that they want to receive it. And I tell you what, I mean, if I've got $100 or $1,000 or $10,000 in my right pocket, that's going to spend differently than $10 million sitting on JP Morgan's balance sheet as a collateralized loan obligation. How do you spend a CLO? How do you spend a CDO? I don't know, but I can tell you how $10,000 gets spent. And if you put that in my pocket or your pocket, that's exactly what's going to be happening. So we've seen an increase in economic activity, very different from 2020 to the present than we had in the 10 years previous, sort of following the global financial crisis. Massive credit expansion following the global financial crisis, but no real inflation. Now, all of a sudden, we are seeing inflation pick up, and it's as governments around the world are doing the exact same thing. So I do think we have significant inflation ahead, and a part of it is a political problem because politicians can and will spend. And you might think of it as vote buying, which to some degree it is. It's solidifying your constituency. It's bringing home the bacon, as they used to say, pork barrel spending. But this is a different means of pork barrel spending. It's not just tax revenue. We're talking about redistributing. We're also talking about taking credit, creating it out of nothing, and giving it to people and saying, and I mean, we're talking about the kinds of policy measures which promote things that you've talked about previously, universal basic income, where I say, I think you need $2,000 a month, and no, you don't have to work for it. I just think you're going to be happier, and the economy is going to go off that much better if you've got that money to spend. That's what we're headed towards, and I think that is inflation to stay, not transitory inflation.
Well, in my limited study of modern monetary theory, the idea is that they can print as much money that they would like without consequence, and that it doesn't really matter. But my challenge with that is twofold. Number one, they have very limited controls over inflation. In modern monetary theory, they say that they can control the money supply through taxation. Well, how high do taxes have to go to call back in $8 trillion that have been put in circulation? To me, that control is rather weak and sort of a double jeopardy. You have inflation and high taxation, which is very, very dangerous for economic growth. But you also have the problem of confidence, David, and you talk quite a bit about the lack of confidence in a currency in your paper. And you've cited examples of throughout history of people who've printed too much money and people have lost confidence in it.
Yeah, go back to Michael Burry's comment that maybe we have hyperinflation. I would put that in a black swan category. It's not something that we can necessarily see or anticipate. But the history of serious inflations, when they trip over into hyperinflation, it's no longer a mathematical problem. It's a psychological problem. It's where people say, I don't want that stinking paper anymore. And there's such a hot potato response to it that all of a sudden, I don't want it, I give it to you, you don't want it, you give it to somebody else, and everybody's trying to get rid of their money as fast as possible. You get visions of Weimar Germany, as Michael Burry does, and the wheelbarrows full of paper in that kind of scenario. I don't know that we'll see that, so I'd probably side more with Steve Forbes.
Steve Forbes, yeah.
Yeah, but I do think higher levels of inflation will be very detrimental to the economy moving forward. And, I think one of the ways that you can look at this is the expansion of money supply. We did away with the broadest measure of monetary supply, M3, a few years ago. Our central bank said, we don't really need it anymore. And this was forever the key metric for anticipating inflation. Well, we got rid of it. So that in itself was problematic in my view. And the European Central Bank, actually, it was the folks at the ECB who were from the German Central Bank. They were very upset when we did away with reporting M3. They said, we can't do any of our long-range planning without the broadest measure of money supply. This is where inflation shows up first. And lo and behold, these are the folks that have this historical, visceral, tragic experience of hyperinflation, 1919 to 1924. And in the paper, I describe a family that I know who had loaned $50,000 to a neighbor. And as this inflation grew to become a hyperinflation, the neighbor came back and paid off that $50,000 with a single chicken. Not exactly the outcome that our family friends were keen on, but that was sort of the destruction of wealth, the destruction of the creditor in that case. And I was going to mention in terms of monetary supply, now we only have M2, and it was less than 5 trillion in the year 2000. It was less than 10 trillion, just under about 8.5 trillion in the year 2010. And now we're above 20 trillion. So it's doubling. But as you double, you go from 5 to 10, then 10 to 20. When you go from 20 to 40 and 40 to 80 and 80 to 160, this is where all of a sudden you begin to see what's known as the exponential function, where, and if you're looking at year over year changes, it's really not that big a deal in terms of a percentage change. But you go back to the base year and you realize, okay, normal money supply 20 years ago was a fraction of the size it is today. And we've lost sight of where we were, and we've lost sight of where we are just by comparing sort of year over year. Anyways, I digress.
I want to point out a couple of things in your paper that were very insightful for me, and that is the idea that inflationism is a policy that leaders use to impose a stealth tax. In other words, they're excited to be able to pay off debts with cheaper currency. And so it doesn't feel like a tax because nobody has voted on it. But through monetary policy, suddenly we are being taxed, particularly the savers who are going backwards as opposed to forwards, in a sense being punished for the money that they've set aside. It turns orthodox economics upside down, doesn't it, David?
It does. And I think it's easiest for an investor to think about putting $100 into some investment. And if you can make 5%, that's great. Okay, you've made 5%. So now your $100 is worth 105. But you do have to pay taxes on that. And so maybe you give up $1.50 of that in tax. So now you're at, $103.50. Right? So that's cut you back a little bit, just paying taxes. No, but what if you also have inflation to factor in to your rate of return? And inflation is, it's running about 3% right now. That means that a 5% rate of return after taxes and after you've accommodated or accounted for inflation, you're basically break even. And actually, as you look at the Treasury market today, this is US Treasury bills, bonds, and notes, short-term bills, intermediate term notes, and long-term bonds. Across our yield curve, everything is negative today. Yeah, if it's yielding 2% because inflation's 3%, you're actually -1%. So in real terms, that is after tax terms, what do you have to show for the risk that you're taking? And this is where all of a sudden, again, you're right, you're turning economics and incentives, what we assume kind of drives the market economy, you're turning it upside down. And from that, you should see a change in behavior, not necessarily for the better. In fact, you drive interest rates lower and lower, as we've seen, and it causes savers to take on greater and greater market risks. Someone who used to say, look, I can just put my savings into a laddered CD portfolio at my local bank and have the magic 5%. Now they can't, because there is no magic 5% on offer in Treasury bills or in CDs. They have to buy junk bonds to have a yield that's even close to that. So bad behaviors are being promoted as a result of forcing both the rates lower, but also increasing inflation so that your real rate of return is deeply negative.
Well, I want to get to some of the solutions in just a moment and some of the advice you have for Christians in regard to fighting off the effects of inflation. But I wanted to bring up some bright spots. I know that one of the key indices that people have been following has been lumber, and lumber is coming down as a result of these supply chain disruptions being mended. We're also seeing a moderation in real estate prices. time on market is starting to get extended. There for a while, I guess back in April, it was just ridiculous. 2 days on the market was getting old. And now we're seeing time on market improve somewhat, and depending on whether you're the buyer or the seller in that case. But I think there are some bright spots, David, that we are seeing inflation somewhat subsiding. Do you have any other evidence of that?
Well, prices are always volatile. There is no perfect price for any asset. And so you'll see things get very expensive and then pull back in a bit. Lumber tripled in price. For it to drop by 50% after tripling is a consolation, but it did triple in price first before it dropped in half. And
Right.
The new level is still higher than the level it started from. So it is a consolation. And that actually is one of the things that Fed Chair 𝗲𝗯𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗵𝗁 Powell looked at and said, yeah, look, lumber's dropping in price. It's transitory. I told you so. But normally you see whether it's, the price of Amazon or Tesla, it may go up 200% and then it may drop 50% to sort of moderate. It's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I wouldn't confuse the 1 step back with lumber or copper or nickel or steel as being anything other than temporary. In fact, I would describe that 1 step back as the transitory factor.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. In your paper, David, you talk about a term that I was unfamiliar with called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity. Could you explain that to us?
Yeah. Catholic social writers and social theorists have talked about subsidiarity for years. And it's basically the idea that those who are closest to a problem will be the best suited to solve the problem. So for instance, in my family, if my son is struggling with something, I'm probably more aware of what's going on there than a school advisor or a state social worker or someone sitting back in Washington, D.C. who's setting child welfare policies. So in other words, the farther you get from the problem, the less connected you are with the real problem and what the adequate solution would be. So the principle of subsidiarity wants to shrink everything back to the lowest level and say, if you have the power to solve the problem, you solve the problem. Don't look for outside help. And if you need outside help, then get outside help, but keep it as local as possible. So for instance, if we have an issue, again, just keeping it very frank with me and my son, if we have an issue that it's beyond my pay grade, then I might turn to our pastor and say, I just need some insight on this. Or someone who's done some family counseling with us and say, I don't understand what's going on here. Can you help me? Right? But I don't call Washington, D.C. for the solution. And yet that's how we have set up our whole welfare system. I think this idea of subsidiarity factors in very importantly into how we as a Christian community deal with the ravages of inflation. As families are pressured and run out of money before they run out of month and are unable to pay their bills, we not only have to have the necessary resources to help them, that is identifying the problem and having some sort of a cushion or extra reserve ourselves to be in a position to be able to help. But then it really is our problem to solve. It's not the government's PPP program or Main Street lending program. It's you and me thinking as a neighbor, thinking about the care and concern of someone in our own community who can't make ends meet. If we have the resources, should we be paying attention to that? Should we be stepping in on a one-on-one basis? And I think the answer is yes. So the idea of subsidiarity just recalculates and says, instead of assuming I've paid my taxes, therefore the government's got this, it brings it back to say, I should be paying attention to my neighbors. I should be loving my neighbors. I should be aware of their story. I should be aware of the stresses and strains which are negatively impacting their marriages, their relational dynamics. And to the degree that I can help, I should, right? So inflation is something that is going to be more and more a reality in the years ahead as a public policy solution for having too much debt. And that's just a given. But how we respond to higher levels of inflation, I think we humanize the situation by maintaining sensitivity to the people who have the greatest needs right under our noses.
Well, I think that's begs the question about those who want to be in a position to have surplus and to be able to help those who are being ravaged by inflation. How do we get prepared? And it goes back to your original thesis of your paper. You tell the story of a person being repaid of a chicken after having a $50,000 note. What is the right response for Christians to be ahead of inflation? How do we rotate our thinking, rotate our investments so that we're not the ones being wiped out by it?
Well, there's definitely room for exegetical critique on this. So I'm not putting myself out as a theologian in this way. This is a very simplistic gloss. But if you looked at man's money as moving towards the infinite and losing value over and over again, it was 3,000 years ago that the Chinese first experimented with paper money. It was a failure, and every iteration of it has failed since, where you've got this catastrophic high level of inflation or hyperinflation event. If you contrasted that with God's money, and again, I'm not a theologian here, I'm just suggesting that it's mentioned so many times in Scripture as an expression of reliable money. Again, means of exchange, a store of value. If we just leave, for the sake of argument, that contrast between man's money and God's money, you see something that is just, it's tough to create. And it's there in limited form. And it's of high value. And as we try to create sort of our own versions of utopia, which take an infinite number of dollars to create, and frankly, are pipe dreams, I think we come back to this notion that securing some part of our wealth in real things makes sense. Whether it is gold and silver, I think that does fit the category. Whether it's land that's productive, that fits the category. If you're thinking like an investor, and are looking for assets, again, you're talking about real things that have cash flow. Obviously gold and silver don't have cash flow, but if you focus on real things, you look at the history of Weimar Germany, and the more basic the real things were, the better off you were. It got to the point where if you had, a famous grand piano, I think we all know, the Steinways is sort of the standard bearer for even that. It was a real thing, but compared with being able to put food on the table, families would exchange a Steinway for a dinner because they had to. So, the real simple answer to your question, Chuck, is investors can diversify into real things. And I think that makes sense. I think that's the simple answer.
Yeah, well, no, that's a real answer. I think there's been what I call a rotation or a shift of people diversifying into those real assets. If you're in the real estate market right now, you're benefiting. You're riding inflation up, where your savings may be getting hurt, but it's offset by a real asset like real estate. I think too, David, one of the things you pointed out in your paper in Austria is the savers got punished, but the debtors were able to pay off their debt very, very easily during a time of inflation, which is so unorthodox. But my friends in Zimbabwe who were wiped out by hyperinflation there, all of their savings those were destroyed. But if they had debt on a house, they were able to pay those off very easily. So I'm not advocating for debt because typically in a right economic environment, debt is not your friend. In hyperinflation, it becomes your friend. And I think that's why some people are trying to determine, is this transitory or not?
Just as a word of caution there for someone who says, well, if that's the case, then I'm not going to worry about paying off my debt and I'll just let inflation take care of it for me. Remember that you need to belong to a politically favored class to have the next scenario not apply to you. You realize that they can take any amount of debt and index it to the devaluation. So you may have a mortgage for $300,000 and it may be re-indexed to be $3 million or $3 billion or $3 trillion. They can redefine what you owe on the basis of that devaluation. And I think where you will see sort of the, the rich don't get the favorable treatment. So it may be that you have something like a jubilee for the poor, but where you're in the middle class or the wealthy, no, you don't. Everything gets indexed. We don't have a generous political class. We have, well, I think that's probably, I don't want to make your program overly political, but we haven't had a generous political class in a long time. And to think that public policy is going to go your way when public policy and inflation as a public policy are a choice, I wouldn't count on it. I would stick with, the principles that Crown teaches. Be very deliberate about getting rid of your debt.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I want you to wrap it up for us with the story that you shared about the German family that did it differently during the time of inflation. I think that it illustrates the way we need to think about what lies ahead for us possibly.
This Thetennis family ran a small coal business in Germany. And at one point, the family decided to invest in a steamship, a small steamer that could go up and down the river. And this allowed them to sell their product in other countries. As soon as they had revenue in foreign currencies, they had something that no one else in Germany had, which was a different form of stability. As the German mark was destroyed, they had foreign currency income because of their trade partnerships outside of their country. That allowed them to take this singular business, the coal business, and eventually buy thousands and thousands of business over. It was about a 2-decade period that Hugo Stinnes consolidated much of industrial Germany because he had something that was very unique and was not subject to the pressures and declines of the Reich mark, of the German mark. And for the person who's not an entrepreneurial genius, I think sidestepping currency devaluation decline is as simple as adding precious metals to a portfolio. It's easy for me to say that and almost do so in a self-interested fashion. My father helped legislate to get gold legalized in the United States. It was illegal from 1933 through January 1st, 1975. And he had worked with Senator Jesse Helms to have the legislation that made it legal again put in place. And that's one of our family businesses since then. That's an easy way to do it. If you're entrepreneurial, if you travel the world, if you're aware of the pressures that are taking place, you can look at the United States and say, maybe I want something other than greenback dollar income. Maybe I want Canadian dollars and Australian dollars or Singapore dollars or euros, or, you have a sophisticated audience as well that could look at that and say, I think I want to duplicate what the Stennis family had, diversify my revenues, as every Fortune 500 company does, multinational does. And that in itself is a protective measure.
Yeah. And of course, the government you were describing, and many times, many of the countries that I've known that go through hyperinflation, outlaw currencies from outside their own, trying to force people into their system. And that's where people would make an argument in favor of cryptocurrencies and digital currencies. At the same time, as we said earlier, they're likely to outlaw those as well in a time of crisis. But that is part of the driver of why people are trying to diversify into what I call a surrogate form of gold, trying to hedge against inflation and hedge against fiat money, devaluing. But David, I think that your paper illustrates God's principles very well. Man's economy is going to always be unstable. It's the house built on sand. God's economy is the house built on the rock. And we can withstand those storms by following his principles. I think being debt-free, being liquid, being diversified, as Solomon said to do, minimizes our risk, minimizes our vulnerability to our circumstances. And I appreciate what you've written, David, and I think it's going to help those who are listening to be wise and to be prudent, to be measured, not hasty in making decisions about how to deal with this. But my view, and I'll give you the last word here, David, my view is the American monetary policy system right now is similar to those who ride the back of a tiger. It's a pretty exciting ride while it lasts, but it's really hard to exit. And I don't think there's a very pretty exit to the scenario that we're living in right now.
I think what makes it beautiful, potentially, is what we see in Acts chapter 2, where the church was defined by a noble voluntarism and generosity. And if you look at the early life of the church, there was a sense in which those who had great abundance looked at that and said, I understand, it's mine, but I don't need it all. And it was not, as some have suggested, the first system of church-sponsored socialism. It was voluntarism. It was generosity. It was individuals saying, Jack, what do you need? Can I help you? I'd love to. Yeah. Let me do that. And it was almost like hospitality and an open home was an expression of an open heart. And talk about kingdom and values alignment, where all of a sudden what's in your bank account, it matters not. It matters not. If you know someone, and this goes back to that sensitivity to what is happening in your own community, in your own family, so to say. And, I live in a small town in Colorado. We know a lot of people in this town. When there's a need, it's pretty well recognized, and we have a choice. Are we going to do something about it, or are we going to assume that someone else is going to take care of that problem? That noble voluntarism and generosity in Acts chapter 2 is how we should engage the times ahead, where we don't look at what we have in sort of resource management as an opportunity or a justification for stinginess. I've met a lot of believers who know how to get rid of debt and they know how to acquire vast sums of money, but they hold on and they don't know what it means to really care for their neighbor. Writing a check is one thing. I think this goes beyond even what money represents. It goes on to a disposition that we need to foster, which is just an openness of heart. Are we really in tune with our neighbors? Are we really in tune with them? If we are, I think we're living in a proper kingdom fashion. And then all of a sudden, the resources that we use to be a blessing to other people, there's no question. Your heart comes first, everything else follows from that.
No doubt about it, David. You remind me of the passage in Hebrews 10 when the believers were recorded as joyfully accepting the confiscation of their property. And that sounds like an oxymoron right there. But they were able to do so because they knew they had better and lasting possessions. And what a indictment against fiat money. God provides something better and something that's lasting. And we can let go of what we have here, knowing that it was not ours to begin with. It was all very temporal.
Good to be with
David,
you, Chuck.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it. If people want to stay in touch with you, how can they get in touch, David?
Yeah, I think a great resource is our weekly podcast. We're now in our 14th year of doing that. And if you're interested in things that relate to money and finance and sort of a cross-section of public policy and international relations, and we tie in a whole lot of different themes, if you go to weeklycommentary.com, or McAlvany Weekly Commentary, but weeklycommentary.com is a great place. You can subscribe for free, and it's a great way to get to know us. We've got archives that go back, almost 15 years now. So plenty for those who are into binge listening, as some of us are into binge watching various shows and whatnot.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. God bless you and your family. You've been a great friend to Crown and to the Christian Economic Forum, and I appreciate you sharing with us today.
I can't wait to see you in a few weeks.
Looking forward to it. Bless you, friend.